The first thing they found was the tongue, pale as a peeled apple, still warm, balanced on the cedar stump that served the settlement as a rough altar every third Sunday when the circuit preacher rode in. It lay there alone in the moonlight, the slick muscle twitching faintly as though it still hoped to shape a word, and beneath it, the stump was guttered with a single black trickle that had dried, looking remarkably like a question mark. No blood anywhere else, no footprints in the dust, only the night insects screaming in the branches overhead as if the woods themselves were being turned inside out. Elias Fentress, the elder who had gone ahead with the lantern to wake the preacher, dropped to his knees and tried to pray, but the sound that came out of him was more like the creak of a rusted hinge. And when he lifted his eyes, he saw that every leaf on every branch had been speared through its center by a pine sliver the size of a sewing needle, so that the whole clearing shivered with 1,000 tiny accusations. No one touched the tongue. They simply stood around it in a ragged ring, 8 men and 2 boys carrying water buckets, all of them smelling the same sour milk odor that had drifted over the ridge the week the first child vanished. Someone, no one afterward would swear to the voice, whispered that the tongue was still trying to confess, and the word it kept attempting was deacon, though the lips that might have confirmed it were nowhere in evidence. By sunrise, the tongue had shrunk to the size of a dried fig, blackened, hard as pewter, and when young Micajah Sutter finally pried it loose with his pocket knife, it left on the cedar a silhouette of itself, a shadow that never weathered away, not even when the stump was later split for kindling and fed to the meeting house stove. That was the winter of 1801 along the Cumberland Trace, when the settlement of Red Bank still believed the world ended 30 miles west at the bend of the Tennessee River, and when the name Midnight Deacon first drifted down from the ridge cabins like smoke too cold to rise. If you're enjoying our horror stories, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a nice comment. Red Banks had begun 8 years earlier as a cluster of pens for hogs that refused to fatten, built by 3 brothers who dreamed of salt but found only iron-rich springs that stained every bucket the color of old bruises. The soil was red, yes, but it was also strangely heavy, holding the daylight long after sunset so that men working their plots at dusk saw their own shadows glowing beneath the hoe blade like subterranean twins. By 1801, there were 32 families, a double-pen storehouse, and a meeting house whose split-log benches still oozed resin that smelled, on hot days, like the inside of a coffin freshly nailed shut. They had no minister of their own. Instead, they waited upon the circuit, a gaunt Virginian named Reverend Locke, who arrived every 28 days with the same cracked leather Bible and the same horse whose ribs he counted aloud as tithe. Between visits, the settlers kept their piety the way they kept their seed corn, dry, dark, and tightly lidded, trusting that restraint itself was a form of worship. Children were warned not to whistle after twilight, women buried dishwater so the stars would not see their leavings, and men, on nights when the wind carried the iron taste of the river, found reasons to walk in pairs to the outhouse, though none of them ever spoke of the dread that rose out of the ground once the temperature dropped. They told themselves the country was new, therefore blameless. They told themselves the Cherokees who had once lived here had left nothing behind but arrowheads and a few peach trees that now bore fruit the size of musket balls, hard and bitter. Yet every spring when the plows turned the furrows, the blades came up freckled with splinters of white ash no one had burned, and the horses sweated blood-spotted foam, though the air was still cool. The Fentress family held the largest clearing, a 200-acre wedge wedged between the ridge and the river bluff, granted by North Carolina land warrants, so fresh the ink had not yet browned. Elias Fentress, patriarch at 50, had arrived with a wife already coughing blood, and 5 children who seemed to age backward, growing shorter each season as though the red earth itself pressed them down. He built a dog-trot cabin whose breezeway always smelled of vinegar and damp iron, then added a second story no one climbed after the baby, born dead and black-lipped, was laid beneath the floorboards to wait the circuit preacher's blessing. The family kept no slaves. Elias had seen what happened to men who owned other men's breath, and he preferred to hire the poor white driftwood that washed down the trace, orphans of the Atlantic cities, deserters from the Navy, indentures who had outlived their usefulness in the Carolinas. One such hireling was the man who would later be called the Midnight Deacon, though when he first stepped out of the cedar shadows he gave no name at all, only a bundle wrapped in sailcloth and the odor of a ship's hold long emptied of cargo. He stood a head taller than any man in the settlement, but his shoulders curved forward as if perpetually bracing for a low doorway, and his eyes were set so deep that pupils and iris vanished together in the socket's shade. Elias took him on for $12 the season plus rations, thinking to take the man's labor before the land took his life, a calculation that had worked with the 3 previous hires. The stranger moved into the fodder loft above the horse stall, and the first thing he built was a bench too narrow for sleeping, as though he intended to spend his nights upright. They might have forgotten him entirely had not the children begun to speak of lantern light drifting across the pasture at the hour when the moon was lowest, a glow that bobbed toward the woods and then went out, always at the same hollow where the peach trees grew stunted. When questioned, the stranger said only that he walked to pray, though no one had ever seen him inside the meeting house, and Reverend Locke, on his next circuit, confessed he had no memory of instructing the man in any catechism. Still, the work was done, fence rails split, tobacco primed, the red earth turned and planted with Indian corn whose leaves came up veined the color of dried blood. Elias paid the wages and tried not to notice that the silver coins he handed over returned to him within the month, spent at the storehouse for nothing more than salt, paper, and lamp oil, items a solitary man might need if he intended to stay awake until the stars burned holes through the sky. By the second season, the stranger had begun to speak in the cadence of worn scripture, addressing the hogs as brethren and the horses as my beloved, so that even the dogs grew hesitant to bark in his presence. When little thankful Fentress, 4 years old, was found sleeping beneath the peach trees with her pinafore folded under her head like a pillow, she told her mother she had followed the night deacon because he sang sweeter than the lullabies she knew, and because he promised to show her how the moon kept its face always pointed toward the same sorrow. The mother, Mercy Fentress, who had buried more children than she had raised, slapped the girl silent and poured turpentine over her scalp to drive out whatever had walked home in her hair. But that night the house smelled of peach blossoms, though the trees were months from flowering, and in the morning the milk had clotted into the shape of a human heart. Rumors are the only crop that flourishes without rain, and by the 3rd summer the settlement had harvested enough to feed every tongue. They said the stranger had come from the coast with a ship's cargo of fever, that he had once been a preacher in Charleston until his congregation locked him beneath the floorboards of their chapel for preaching on texts that were not in any Bible they owned. They said he had eaten the tongues of sailors to learn foreign languages, that he kept a communion cup made from a soldier's skull, that he baptized babies by holding them under water until they forgot the taste of milk. Children whispered that if you walked backward around the fodder loft at midnight, you would hear him inside reciting the names of every person who would die before the next circuit Sunday, and that the last name was always your own. Yet no one denied that the corn stood taller where his shadow had fallen, or that the hogs he touched grew fat while their litter mates wasted, ribs showing like the slats of a ruined organ. When Elias Fentress broke his leg in the cleft of a fallen oak, the stranger carried him 2 miles through darkness, walking so smoothly that Elias swore the ground itself had softened to receive his boots, and afterward the bone healed without fever, the skin knitting so cleanly that the scar looked drawn by a quill. Gratitude is a stubborn weed. It sprouts even in the shadow of dread, and for a time the settlement convinced itself that usefulness was the same as grace. But grace, if it comes at all, comes only once, and what returns afterward is memory wearing its skin. The second disappearance was not a child, but a voice. Reverend Locke's horse arrived riderless on the Sunday he was expected, saddle wet with dew and smelling of river water, the Bible strapped beneath the seat open to the 22nd chapter of Genesis with the verse, "And they went both of them together," scored through by a fingernail so deeply that the paper fluttered like a moth wing every time the wind moved. Search parties ranged the trace for 3 days, finding nothing but a campfire's remains on the bluff above the river, 5 stones set in a half circle, and in their center a child's shoe turned upside down, the sole filled with rainwater in which floated 3 human teeth. No one spoke of the stranger. No one needed to. That night, Elias Fentress woke to find the hired hand standing at the foot of his bed, hat in hand, eyes reflecting the hearth coals like wet pewter. "The land remembers what the river forgives," the man said, voice soft as mold on wheat. And when Elias reached for his musket, the figure was already gone, leaving only the smell of lamp oil and the faintest drift of peach blossom. In the fodder loft, they found the stranger's bundle unwrapped. Inside, neatly folded, lay the reverend's collar, stiff with dried blood, and beneath it a stack of papers covered in a script that looked like English reflected in dark water, the letters reversed as if written from the inside of a mirror. They burned the bundle at once, but the smoke refused to rise, settling instead along the ground like fog, and where it touched the grass, the blades withered in the shape of footprints walking away toward the river. If you're enjoying our horror stories, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a nice comment. The winter that followed was the coldest in memory, the Cumberland freezing so hard that wagon wheels left scars on the surface that did not melt until March, long after the bodies beneath had begun their slow drift toward warmer latitudes. Ice sealed the wells. Smoke from the chimneys fell downward and pooled like gray scarves around the eaves. Mothers woke to find their infants' lips blue, though the cradle sat only feet from the hearth. In the Fentress dog trot, the hired man continued to take his meals standing, never removing the wide felt hat whose brim cast his face into permanent dusk. Mercy Fentress, sleepless and sore from coughing, began to dream of a second mouth opening beneath her own tongue, a mouth that whispered sermons while she tried to shape lullabies, and when she woke, the pillow was always damp with something saltier than tears. She took to walking the frozen pasture before dawn, barefoot so the pain might keep her thoughts her own, and on the 7th morning she found the peach trees cracked open lengthwise, their hearts exposed as pale and slick as new butter, each trunk carved with a single word: remember. No axe had done it. The bark stood apart like lips mid-sentence, and the sap had hardened into amber beads that looked remarkably like teeth. She ran back to the house, but Elias only stared at her footprints, which had filled with blood, though her soles were intact. And that night he nailed shut the breezeway doors, telling the children that drafts carried fever, though everyone knew the real sickness came on 2 legs and wore a human smile. Circuit Sunday arrived again, though Reverend Locke did not. The settlement gathered anyway, 27 souls huddled in the meeting house whose chinking had shrunk in the cold so that knives of wind slid through and pricked whatever skin was exposed. Elias Fentress, elected by default, rose to read from the book of Job, but his voice cracked on the word messenger, and in the pause that followed they heard footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate, as though someone measured the building for a coffin. Snow had begun to fall straight down without wind, so each flake arrived intact, printing itself against the shingles like a signature on parchment, and with every step the snow puffed inward through the cracks, carrying the odor of lamp oil and river mud. The congregation tried to sing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," but the hymn staggered, each syllable arriving late, as if the cold had thickened the air into syrup. In the middle of the second verse, the stranger stepped through the door without opening it. Later, no one could agree whether he had simply appeared or whether the logs had parted like curtains and closed again behind him. He walked to the front, removed his hat for the first time, and revealed a scalp hairless and shining as river stone, crossed by a single scar that ran from brow to crown and seemed, when he turned, to move slightly, as though the wound had never finished bleeding. Without preamble, he began to preach, voice soft yet filling every corner so the boards vibrated like drumheads. As he spoke, the lamp flames leaned toward him as if drawn by inhalation, and shadows detached themselves from the walls and knelt. When he finished, there was no sound except the settling of snow on the roof, and then the stranger walked out, leaving footprints that began human but ended in something cloven, a detail no one admitted noticing until weeks later, when thaw revealed the same prints burned into the frozen clay beneath the stump where the tongue had first appeared. That night the settlement kept fires lit, not for warmth but for witness. No one wanted to be the first to close his eyes. Around midnight, a low chant drifted across the ridge, syllables indistinct but unmistakably paced like the psalms Reverend Locke had sung while riding the circuit, only slower, as though each word were being pulled backward through the throat. Families barred doors and pushed chests against them, yet the sound seeped through chinks like water finding its level. One woman, newly delivered of a stillborn son, opened her window and saw every hog standing upright on its hind legs in the moonlight, forelegs folded as if in prayer, facing the river. She screamed, and the hogs dropped back to all fours and scattered, but in the snow their hoof prints overlapped so completely with human footprints that afterward no tracker could tell which had come first. By morning, 3 more children were missing, taken from beds that showed no disturbance save for the faint smell of lamp oil and peach blossom. And this time, no one suggested forming a search party. Instead, they gathered in the storehouse and spoke in whispers of leaving, of striking west toward the Chickasaw Tract, though everyone knew the stranger had walked that direction hours earlier, and the snow had not yet covered his tracks. Elias Fentress stayed behind when the others dispersed, claiming someone must inventory the seed corn, lest they starve before reaching whatever refuge they imagined. In truth, he could not bear the thought of the stranger walking unopposed across his acres, could not endure the notion that land he had bled for might remember only the tenant's tread. He climbed the fodder loft with a lantern and found the straw arranged into a perfect circle, flattened as if by tremendous weight, and in its center a book bound in hide the color of dried tobacco. Elias tore the page out and folded it into his shirt, then set fire to the rest, but the flames refused to consume the cover. Instead, it curled and bled a sap that smelled of baptismal water left standing too long. He dropped the blasphemous thing into the snow, where it hissed and sank, leaving a rectangular wound that did not refill even when the drifts melted. That night he slept with the musket across his chest and dreamed of a mouth opening beneath the floorboards of the house, a mouth large enough to swallow the dog trot entire. And when he woke, the barrel was warm as if recently fired, though he had no memory of pulling the trigger. Downstairs, Mercy sat at the table, eyes wide, lips cracked from whispering, and in her lap lay the tongue again, no longer dried but plump and pink, pulsing gently as if it had just been severed. She claimed Thankful had carried it in, barefoot through the snow, but the girl was nowhere to be found, and the footprints leading away from the door were twice the length of any human foot and ended at the peach orchard where the split trunks had begun to bleed a clear syrup that tasted, Elias would later write, like the memory of sweetness rather than sweetness itself. The syrup hardened overnight into brittle amber threads that cracked beneath the weight of silence, so that every step across the orchard sounded like bones breaking under a shroud. Elias wrapped the tongue in a feed sack and buried it beneath the fodder loft, digging through frost until the ache in his knuckles felt like penance. Yet even as he tamped the earth, he heard a faint, wet percussion. Pulse answering pulse, rising from the grave of what should have been inert. Mercy stood above him holding the lantern, her breath feathering sideways as though reluctant to ascend, and in that stuttering glow her face appeared eroded, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows of their own. Elias struck her, not from anger, but from terror that his wife had become a ventriloquist for soil, and the lantern fell, shattering coal oil across the snow, a brief blue blossom that hissed itself into darkness. When the flame died, the night seemed denser, as if the fire had been the last aperture through which the world exhaled. And in that compression they heard the first definite footfall on the trace. Not the strangers, but many, the cadence of a procession too disciplined for settlers, too irregular for soldiers. Mercy pressed her palm to her husband's coat and felt the paper he had torn from the blasphemous book crackle like a small animal trying to escape. Together they climbed the dog trot's second story, a space used only for drying herbs and storing the cradle that had waited through 5 births for one living cry, and from its single shuttered window they watched the ridge bloom with torches arranged in a perfect equilateral, points swaying but never drifting closer, as though the bearers marched in place upon some hidden treadwheel. Each repetition grew softer, yet the distance between sound and listener shrank until Elias felt the words forming inside his own skull, syllables nudging like fingertips testing the ripeness of fruit. At dawn, the torches were gone, but the ridge bore scorch marks in the shape of an open jaw, teeth pointing downslope toward the settlement, and along the cleft where the jaw hinged, a thin seam of red clay had surfaced through the limestone, moist and warm as fresh wound. Elias scraped a sample into a jar, thinking to send it with the next flatboat to Nashville, where a doctor might recognize the stink of carrion theology. But the clay cooled into a puckered plug that resembled a scar, and when he lifted the jar to daylight, the inside was already furred with pale rootlets trying to sprout in the absence of seed. Downstairs, Mercy had stoked the hearth to an unnatural roar, feeding it split cedar, though the day was mild, and she stood so close her skirts singed, releasing threads of smoke that spelled no letters, yet seemed urgently alphabetic. She had no memory of composing it, only of waking with the quill still twitching in her grip, nib worn to a needle and dripping something darker than ink. Elias folded this second paper into his coat beside the first, and the 2 pages rustled against each other like conspirators whispering across a cell wall. The day's labor waited, corn to crib, hogs to slaughter, fence to mend, but every chore felt like rehearsal for a drama whose script had already been burned. They moved through sunlight that seemed to fall at a slant incompatible with the season, shadows pooling at their feet like liquid. They must wade through simply to reach the barn. By midday, the settlement had reassembled in the storehouse, not for worship, but for evacuation. Wagons stood hitched, oxen blowing steam that froze in midair and fell to the ground as brittle beads. Yet conversation stalled whenever someone tried to name the direction of flight. West lay the Chickasaw Session, east the Cumberland Mountains already closed by snow, south the trace they had ridden in on now rumored to be patrolled by the torched procession whose members left footprints filled with red clay no wind could dry. North meant the river, and the river meant the flatboat crews who spoke of whirlpools that followed boats like hungry dogs, of sandbars that shifted overnight to spell names no passenger recognized until too late. While they debated, the storehouse darkened though the sun still rode high, and they realized the windows were being latticed from outside by peach branches that had sprouted fresh shoots in the hours since dawn, bark still split and weeping syrup that clouded the glass like breath. Inside, the temperature dropped until words tumbled out white and lingered, each syllable hanging long enough to be read before it dissolved. The word congealed mid-air, a small gray loaf that fell to the floorboards and rolled until it fetched up against the cedar stump, now serving as butcher's block where it split open, revealing a core of pink muscle that beat 3 times before melting into the wood. The settlement watched without protest, too emptied of agency even to step backward, and in the hush, they heard the fodder loft door of the Fentress place slam shut, though it stood a quarter-mile distant, the sound traveling through air that carried messages the way iron carries sparks. Elias, arriving late, pushed through the peach-laced doorway carrying a saddlebag swollen with papers, pages torn from ledgers, from the family Bible, from the blank book he had found and failed to burn. He had not intended to obey. He had intended to scatter the pages into the stove and watch prophecy char, but the ink bled through the fibers, and the fire would not take them, releasing instead the smell of baptismal water left standing too long, the same odor that now rose from every pore of the storehouse floor. He told the others what he had found, voice steady only because terror had sanded it smooth. And when he finished, Micajah Sutter stepped forward holding a peach branch whose leaves were already curling, though it had been cut minutes ago. Micajah pressed the branch to Elias's lips as if offering communion, and sap, warm, faintly metallic, trickled into Elias's mouth, coating his tongue so thickly he could feel it swelling against his teeth, a second muscle trying to speak from inside the first. The taste was not fruit, but memory of fruit, not sweetness, but the ache left when sweetness is removed, and with it came certainty. Flight was impossible because the story they inhabited had already been written to its conclusion, and every step they took west or east or north or south was merely a rereading of lines etched into the earth before their grandparents had drawn breath. They left the storehouse at dusk, not because anyone commanded, but because the branches had woven the doorway shut, and the only egress was to walk forward into the orchard, where the moon now rose the color of a wound draining clear. Each carried a lantern, though the snow reflected enough light to read by, and the combined glow made their shadows overlap until they appeared to share a single elongated body stitched together at the soles. The peach trees had grown since morning, trunks thick as mill wheels, bark split so wide a child could hide inside the fissure, and from every cleft issued the chant now reduced to a heartbeat, "Tongue River Peach, Tongue River Peach." Elias walked at the front, not as leader, but as custodian of the papers that fluttered inside his coat like birds with broken wings, and when he reached the cedar stump, he found it dressed as an altar, white linen no woman of the settlement owned, a communion cup turned from pewter blackened by fire, and arranged around it a ring of tongues, some human, some hog, some too small to name, each balanced upright in the snow like mushrooms that had sprouted mouths. Behind him the settlers formed a semicircle, lanterns trembling until the flames leaned inward, drawn toward the center, as if the altar were the true zenith and the sky merely reflection. Snow continued to fall, but never touched the linen. Instead, it swirled upward at the last instant and adhered to the underside of an invisible canopy, accumulating until the air itself seemed roofed with white, a cavern whose ceiling lowered by the minute. No one spoke. Speech had become redundant. They watched the snow roof descend until it grazed the tops of the peach trees, and where contact occurred, the bark split wider, releasing clouds of pale moths that had been wintering inside the wood. The moths circled the altar 3 times, then arranged themselves upon the linen to spell a single word: receive. The misspelling was more terrible than any correct prophecy, evidence that whatever intelligence guided this rite had learned their language imperfectly, or perhaps had learned it too well and now mocked their reliance on spelling as a hedge against chaos. Elias felt the papers in his coat grow hot, then cold, then hot again, cycling through temperatures that belonged to fevered skin, and when he could bear it no longer, he drew them out and laid them atop the tongues. Ink bled upward into the moths, staining their wings until they became a cloud of tiny pages, each bearing a fragment of the palindrome, and the cloud folded in on itself, compressing into a dark ovate shape that hovered above the cup. From its underside descended a thread, no thicker than a hair, of red clay, which entered the pewter vessel and began to fill it from within, though the quantity seemed greater than the space allowed, as if the cup were merely the visible mouth of a reservoir extending miles beneath. When the clay reached the brim, the thread snapped. The ovate cloud dispersed into ash that fell upward and sealed itself into the snow roof, and the settlers found themselves holding objects they did not remember picking up: a cradle board, a rusted branding iron, a child's shoe still filled with teeth. Then came the step they would replay in dreams for whatever remained of their lives. Each person, without consultation, approached the altar and drank. Not from the cup, the clay had hardened into a plug, but from the tongues themselves, which leaked a clear fluid that tasted of iron and peach and river silt, a taste so precisely located between sorrow and ecstasy that refusal felt like apostasy. They drank until the tongues withered to husks that cracked apart, releasing a sigh audible only to the drinker, a sigh that spelled their own name backward, and with the exhalation came knowledge of what had been taken and what might yet be returned, though the exchange rate was ruinous. Elias tasted the moment Mercy's first child had died, the tiny body cooling against her nightgown while she sang a lullaby she would never remember afterward, and he understood that the stranger, Deacon, Midnight Deacon, was not a man, but a functionary, a toll-keeper exacting payment for the crime of settlement itself, the original sin of believing land could be owned without first being swallowed. When the last settler had drunk, the snow roof collapsed inward, not as weight but as memory, and every flake carried the imprint of a word spoken in a language that predated Cherokee, Chickasaw, even the mastodon whose tusks occasionally surfaced in the red clay, like accusations petrified mid-sentence. The orchard went dark, not from absence of moon but from surplus of history pressing against the eyeballs, and in that darkness they heard the fodder loft door slam again, though they stood too far away for the sound to carry, and they knew the deacon had returned to collect the final installment.